Hi, everyone. This is Eric Pennington with the Spirit of EQ. And joining me today is Jeff East with the Spirit of EQ. Hi, Jeff.
Hi, Eric, and everybody out there that's listening and or watching.
And this is the second part of our series on motorcycles, Neil Peart, and emotional intelligence. We're doing this webinar a little bit different than we have previously in that we don't have any audience participation today. So we'll just be recording it, which you'll be able to check out obviously on our YouTube channel and other places as well. So Jeff, today I'm excited to talk about this again. I know we kind of dug into it a bit in the first part and finding out your history and experience with riding motorcycles, and also that you have that in common with Neil Peart and some things that he's done that are really good showcases for emotional intelligence. So really looking forward to this. What we'll do now is I'm going to go ahead and share our screen and get our presentation up, and then we'll get right into it.
Okay.
And there we are. So what you may or may not remember, the slides that we're going to look at are going to be around, again, that idea of what we can glean from experiences in riding a motorcycle and some of the experiences with Neil Peart and emotional intelligence. One key thing for today is that we're going to focus on primarily the pathway to growth and what happens when you make a change, not so much a change that is forced upon you, if you will, but the kind of change where you kind of look at your life or your art or your work or whatever, and you say, you know, it's time for me to either get better or do something different. So that's kind of the essence of where we're going today. So in the first part, Jeff, we talked a bit about your journey on the bike. As I may have mentioned, I think in the first part, I have like zero experience with bikes outside of seeing them on the road. There's some bikes I've looked at and thought, man, that looks pretty cool. However, that's about where it stops. So Jeff, in the spirit of that growth and change perspective, what over the years have you done that you kind of saw that you needed to change or you needed to adapt to get better at riding?
Well, there's a couple of things. I think some of it comes with age. When first I grew up on a farm, so I was riding since I was 12 or 13 on dirt bikes. Mm-hmm. It wasn't until I was probably 19 or 20 before I ever actually had wheels to asphalt. So one, that's a dramatic change. As I got older, like now, I don't have any desire to go off-road anymore because it's not something I want to do. There's more chance of going down, all kinds of things like that. It's just not what I like. But what I've seen happen is when I first started riding on the road, the goal was fast all the time. One of the kind of things people would say about like going through corners is you would try to drag the axle nut you were leaned over so far, which is impossible. But, it was a mark of, I don't know if courage is the right word, mm-hmm. but to have your foot pegs kind of ground down a little bit from the way you were going around corners. And people would look at your tires and see how far the scuff marks were on the sidewalls. If you look at that tire that's right there, right, the idea is you just didn't wear the middle of the tire down. You wore the sides down, which proves you were going fast through corners. And it's still fun to do that very occasionally, but it's not what I like now in riding. I still like to ride quick. I'm not a fan of freeways. That is extremely boring. But now riding, and a lot of people think I'm strange when I say that, is my quiet time. Oh. And I know we did a podcast about group riding, which I would still enjoy that. But now I really prefer solo rides. Because it's a decompression time for me. When you're riding, even if you're not riding, really fast, you still have to really be concentrating on what you're doing. Mm-hmm. And for me, I think what happens is that concentration puts all that stuff that's usually churning in our brains every day, the stuff we have to deal with, and everything else, it has to be put in the back, or you'll end up in a bad situation. So it's a decompression time. I've learned that it's a relaxing time. And the other thing I think is um, what you're thinking about, especially as you get older, is I've become an offensively defensive writer, which is kind of a weird term.
Yeah.
I've learned that there's defensive riding in this case, since it's a motorcycle, but you have to be offensive with it. You have to be looking ahead. You have to be more aware, and I've learned that as I've ridden. When you stop at a stoplight, you watch behind you, and you always have a place, an escape route. Usually, like if it's at a stop site, you stop, and with enough room, if somebody doesn't stop behind you, you can get between the cars that are in front of you.
Wow.
A
Man,
lot of that.
can I ask you, Jeff, I interrupted
Yeah.
you, but did you learn that from someone? And I'm specifically speaking to because that's really, that's pretty powerful, the idea that you're giving yourself enough space that if someone behind you doesn't stop, you can maneuver out. Did you learn that? Did someone specifically teach that, or did you figure that out sort of?
Some books I've read,
Hmm.
watching other writers, things like that. One of the things that kind of aggravates me is a lot of accidents that riders get into are instigated by what we call cagers, people in cars, because they have the steel cage around them.
Hmm.
But if you're offensively, defensively riding,
Right.
you can avoid even those. So a lot of the times, it's kind of sad to me that a lot of riders get these accidents they should have been able to ride because they don't know the capability of a motorcycle. Nobody's ever taken the time to show them or taken the time to learn. A motorcycle has tremendous stopping power compared to a car. It
Mm-hmm.
has a tremendous acceleration compared to a car if something's coming up from you behind. And because of its size and how it can maneuver, it can get away with things. So that's what I'm talking about is knowing your capabilities, knowing the capabilities of the bike. And a lot of people might be hearing this and thinking, well, when I'm riding, all I'm thinking about is doom and despair. But this, we've talked about this before when we talk about emotional intelligence. When it becomes a practice and you've learned how to do it, it's not in the forefront of your mind anymore. So it's not taking away from the fun of the ride, from the
Yeah.
relaxation of the ride. It's just a practice. You just learn to do it.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I know that here in a little bit, we're going to talk a little bit about Neil Peart and his journey as an artist, as a musician. And it's interesting, Jeff, when you mentioned the fact that it's not something that you're overtly conscious of anymore because you've practiced it, you've made it your art, if you will. So when you think about some of the things that you've done over the years, whether again they were changes that you needed to make because of fill in the blank, force change, offensive change, if you will, proactive
Okay.
change. What are some of the EQ competencies that maybe come to your mind that you've really relied on to help you in that process?
Well, I think part of it is, especially as I've gotten a little bit older, when got married, had kids, so consequential thinking,
Mm.
the responsibility I had to know that I do have responsibilities to my wife, to my children, to the place I worked. So understanding that if I want to continue to ride, but I don't want to turn that into something that's going to cause problems for other people or for myself. So that is when I really started looking at learning how to hone those skills of being a safe rider.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, there's fast riders and then there's good fast riders, and try to become one of the latter, because
Right.
understanding that. So applying consequential thinking, and then I think what triggered that is engaging intrinsic motivation. What do I want to get out of writing? What is it that I like about it? What is it that
Mm-hmm.
is going to motivate me to continue to do it? What is going to motivate me to get better? So I think engaging intrinsic motivation and that, and then the other one I think would be recognizing patterns. Understanding the motivations for that kind of thing.
Gotcha.
So
That makes a lot of sense. I can see how that applies, and hopefully, those of you who are watching, listening, can glean some lessons around how you look at various areas of your life that may or may not be directly correlated to motorcycle riding. But obviously, I can definitely see, Jeff, how if I apply this approach in multiple areas of life, I'm probably going to have a better outcome. And
and I think
the spirit of go ahead.
I think one of the things that we need to mention is any of these terms that maybe they've not heard, like consequential thinking, engaging intrinsic motivation, recognizing patterns. Those are all competencies in our model of emotional intelligence. And if they go to the Spirit of EQ podcast, they'll have some in-depth discussion about those.
Yeah, that's a great call out, Jeff. And I would highly recommend those of you, again, viewing and listening, to check out our podcast, because we have episodes that are dedicated specifically to each of the competencies. I know early on in our history there. So that'd be a great place to go. So as we look at it, Jeff, we talked about that as it relates to what you've done to improve or change.
Mm-hmm.
Seems like you've applied some wisdom across the years in your writing, which, I think most people would appreciate. And it's not a downer. It's not a, hey, I can't do this anymore or that anymore. It's just recognizing, I kind of liken it. I'm a big fan of NBA basketball and its history. As Michael Jordan got older, he began to refine his game to create a longer career. And some of that was related to a fadeaway jumper, not to get too wonky in the basketball terminologies. And then you're mentioning of the EQ competencies that you used. And I think for the audience, it'd be a great idea as you're, kind of processing a bit, is take an area of your life and those competencies that that Jeff.
Sorry about that. We got a nut job of a dog.
That's the
Winnie.
that's the power of working remotely.
Yes.
So with that, some of those EQ competencies that you can actually look at and kind of use them as tools in your pursuits as it relates to whether it's your personal life or professional life. So next up, we're going to think about some of the ideas around that journey, because it'd be great if we could make changes and that everything would just happen with the snap of the finger. But as I know, Jeff, as well as I do, it just doesn't work that way.
No.
And our constant refrain, you'll hear this in our trainings and our one-on-ones, is that there must be a willingness to put in the work and the practice.
Exactly.
The reward for it is awesome. On the front side, if you're not used to practicing and working, in this case, maybe on yourself, it can be a little bit daunting, but trust me, it is worth, embracing those two ideas. Mm-hmm. So we're going to share a brief video as we begin to talk about Neil Peart. And Jeff, as I set up this video a little bit, and we've talked about this more than a few times, just offline, that, he came to a place in his musicianship, his artistry, where he made a decision that he wanted to make some changes to how he approached playing the drum kit. And in this interview, he kind of speaks to that specifically. And then after we look at the video, Jeff, we can discuss some of the things that you and I have kind of pulled out just, even beyond. So let's go ahead and take a look.
Okay.
I wonder what your relationship with drumming and how it's changed over the years, because you've done it so long, and drumming for Rush it's not like you just do. I mean, there's some stuff going on there, right?
Yeah.
So Has your relationship with your the instrument changed over the years?
Enormously so, in all those inner ways that might be boring to anyone else, but I feel them strongly. And it occurred to me lately that the band, even after all these years, 36 years, we're going through changes right now as individual musicians, and thus, as a unit of musicians. And I found that part of it's been deliberate, that I've studied with teachers from time to time. And 2 years ago, I studied with the great jazz drummer, Peter, and it was mainly to learn more about big band drumming that I admire. But in the process, of course, I couldn't help learning more about drumming, and carried it with me into what I do. And the teachers that I've had in the past, I had a great old-time teacher in the mid-90s that kind of helped me reinvent the way I approach the instrument, that still nourishes me now. And the inspiration of other players too, when you hear somebody play something great, old or new, it inspires you. And I found since I was a little kid, not that I wanted to imitate it, but it just made me want to play, and not in, I've heard some musicians say, there was a famous one of Eric Clapton saying he wanted to burn his guitar after hearing Jimi Hendrix. And wanting to smash his horn after hearing Miles Davis, that kind of thing. And I never understood that. If I hear somebody great, it makes me want to go home and play, like not out of frustration, but out of joy.
I mean, there are a lot of people who heard a Neil Peart drum and went, I want to smash my drums.
Well, I hear that people say, "Oh, you inspired me to take up drumming." And I said, "I'm sorry to your parents." What else can I say?
So when you go on one of these journeys and you've met new teachers and you come back, do Geddy and Alex start to panic? Like, Neil's back with a new sound. We have to, oh God, here we go.
Well, of course, they're subtle and incremental, but the one big change I made in '95, where I changed the whole setup of my drums and temporarily the way I held the sticks, and just dedicated myself to doing everything different. And when I first came back with the band, and we were working with producer Peter Collins at the time, and he was listening to my playing on the demos and so on, and saying, "Well, it doesn't sound that much different to me." And to me, that was a compliment, because I changed everything and it still sounded like me. And then when I started playing with the other guys, they did notice the clock was a subtle difference, that they had to mesh with me. And I mean, these things are indefinably subtle, but they were things that I've wanted to work on for 20 years. And I guess a good example of it is technique. I work so much with sequencers and click tracks that I became remarkably metronomic, but that had a rigidity that went with it. So my mission then became to conquer that and become looser. So if you think of a technique instrument and a feel player, those are the two differences that I tried to bridge, and I'm still trying to bridge. I want to become more improvisational because I'm compositional. And my last drum instructional video was on drum soloing. And I said I compose a solo and then perform the variations within it as a piece of music for the audience. And right at that moment I said, "Oh, okay, I'm a composer, but I want to be an improviser." So I started working really hard on that. And now at this point, the first half of my solo is completely improvised from the first beat, through changes that I become familiar with and come to like in the process of a night's discovery, or even in the night's warm-up, I'll come across something, "Oh, that's good," and it goes in the solo that night.
So for a guy that has, to adding the improvisation to your routine, when you get out on stage and you have to play and you know that the first part is completely improvised, do you get scared?
It was nervous making it first, but then you learn to protect yourself, and that the second half is composed, again, for the audience's benefit.
Just get to that second half?
Well, it's never, no, I get lost in it, and I've made comparisons to exploring on the motorcycle, getting lost on roads that close. Yeah. And I wander down rhythmic areas because I do challenge myself, because there are no consequences. There's no mistake. If I do something weird, play it twice, and it's a new part, a jazz instrumentalist once told me.
Have you ever had the drumming solo equivalent of a motorcycle hitting a deer? Have you ever been?
Good comparison, because I've certainly had that experience. But again, in soloing you can't, and that's why I'm more careful in the band's music, because the proverbial train wreck where the whole band gets lost is a nightmare. And we've, over the years, of course, evolved ways out of that. It happens to everybody. You mishear a rhythm or an echo off the back wall of the venue sometimes, can be a half beat out, and if you lose concentration for a second, you're suddenly half a beat out with the other guy. And we just look at each other and you decide, okay, go with him.
All right. So what did you see in that interview, Jeff, that really leaped out for you?
The idea that he didn't say he was in this video, but in a band, especially, Rush is a three-man band. So they're all integral to it. It's very noticeable. But he talked about adapting if something happened, and he didn't really say it, but a rock drummer never gets the credit I think they deserve, because they're really the leader in a certain way. They keep everybody together. Uh, if the bass player or the guitar player in this case maybe get out of rhythm some way, they can kind of stop for a few beats and then get right back into it. The drummer has to keep driving the thing. And if you listen to some of his songs, it's so heavily driven by what he's doing, but he doesn't do it in a show-off way. The other thing I liked what he talked about is drum solos. I am not a fan of drum solos. I play the bass. I'm not a fan of bass solos. That's not their job in my opinion, in a band, in a group. But his drum solos are so amazing. He's probably the only drummer I can really listen to do a drum solo. I've seen him play live. But it's coming from him. And when he talked about the improvisation part and then the structured part, it shows his ability to adapt. So that really struck me in what he was talking about. But just
I think that his approaches, and typically when I hear interviews with artists, I always think about the application to life. And he mentioned the inevitability of the mistake. And even as talented and as skilled, whatever you want to call it, that they are as musicians, the reality that they're going to make mistakes, and that they have, and the idea that being able to navigate when they happen. I think sometimes in our culture, people feel a tremendous amount of pressure to always get it right, to have the perfect presentation, or the perfect sales call, or the perfect one-on-one with my manager. And I think, at least from a career standpoint, you're going to be a lot freer when you realize that there is an inevitability of the mistake. And really what matters is how you navigate once the mistake has happened. How about from an EQ perspective? I know I asked you about, your experiences in riding a bike. Obviously in this case, Neil Peart made a conscious decision to make a change. What do you think about from that standpoint? How can EQ help when you're in that place, when you're saying, I'm going to go in a different direction?
Well, I think it starts with our first competency, which is, emotional literacy. He had to, it's hard to put words into somebody's mouth because you don't know, but it would seem like he would have had these emotions of, I want to get better. I'm not really pleased with how I'm playing, or I know I can do better. So he needed to understand those emotions and hear what they were telling him. And then once again, I think he would have to engage his intrinsic motivation. Why am I doing this? Am I doing this because I want to be considered the best rock drummer ever, which a lot of people already do consider him that, and I'm one of them? Or am I doing this because this is inside of me? That's intrinsic. Wanting to be known as the best rock drummer ever is extrinsic. It's what other people are saying about it. I think he was very intrinsically motivated to do what he did, to put the effort into what he did. When, a sad day was when I heard that Rush was retiring. Neil and then the guitar player, Alex Lifeson, both have joint bursitis and tendonitis. And if you've ever seen Neil play, it's so physical. He's got bursitis in both shoulders.
Yeah.
So they could have easily went their career and not tried to improve, and everybody would have been happy except them, except Neil. He wouldn't have been happy, I don't think.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think also too, sometimes, in an age where we seem to be living on reaction, getting up every day and just reacting to whatever's thrown at us, good, bad, or in between. I think emotional intelligence is a key tool that you can use to add some proactivity inside of what comes at you every day. This idea that you use the intrinsic motivation versus the extrinsic, those pursuits, the things that happen outside of us are just going to happen. However, we have a choice every day to go inward, right? Find out where we want to go. And though we can't guarantee it and we don't have control over the future, we can certainly put ourselves in a position to have some influence on it as we're moving through. So as we get close to the end here, powerful reflection, question to reflect on. If you're an audience, in the audience, what's one thought-provoking idea you gleaned from today's session that you can apply in the next week? And I know for me, and I didn't mention this at the beginning, Jeff, nor did I online, I was reading an interview, an old interview with Miles Davis from Spin Magazine back in 1985. That's when the interview was conducted. And he talked about, as an artist, he had always had a desire to want to move forward and wanting to be better and to find new ground and new places. And it really has been inspiring for me to examine those areas of my life that I want that as well. Recognizing, and for the audience, is that, you might have some folks that maybe will be uncomfortable with your desire to improve or get better. However, I would tell you, it's not, we're not advocating that you tell those people to hit the highway. It's kind of you in a very subtle way saying, I'm going to do this because it's what's best for me, and I want you along for the journey. But if it's not something you can support or be a part of, I understand. At least that's my perspective.
Yes.
Is there anything, Jeff, from you that was thought-provoking from the session between the motorcycle ride and from Neil Peart?
Well, I think it wasn't really so much about anything we talked about. It was, some of the stuff I was looking at. And before I read a really good in-depth article in Modern Drummer. And we talked about the last question the person asked, is this interviewer had been observing them as they were getting ready at recording an album. And he noticed that when Neil was going back and listening to a track, and they were also videotaping it, he was not looking at himself. He had his eyes closed. So he was not concentrating on his technique as he was playing it. He was concentrating on, is this how I want it to sound? So I think as leaders, we need to concentrate on, am I getting the results I want, and not so much am I doing the technique the right way. Paying attention to what's going on around you. If you're in an organization, am I bringing to that organization what I should be bringing, and not worrying about how I do it, but being aware of the results you're getting. Because if you're not paying,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
If you're not paying attention to the results that you're getting, how else do you know if you're doing what you need to be doing? And he was paying attention to the results he wanted to get. I've read a book by Neil Peart, and he is a very, very deep thinker, and I think he does that in every part of his life. So that's really what I'm thinking. So
yeah, your insights there really got me thinking about this idea about the why behind our endeavors, right? And I know in some organizations, maybe many organizations, where there's such a emphasis on technique and technical skill and all of those things. And sometimes it can get lost, the idea about, why are we doing this, and what results are we getting? And if the results that we're getting are not what we want, are we stopping, right? And evaluating and kind of asking ourselves, what's the purpose here? And that kind of takes me back to your motorcycle from even part one of this series. These ideas of, you didn't just hop on a bike and just accelerate and have no recollection or any kind of insight as to what you were doing. And I think oftentimes that can happen, right? You're told you should be this, you should do that, and you just kind of mechanically do it and not really understand, the depth of what's in front of you. So
I think one of the things that I really learned from writing is it's a very visceral activity.
mm-hmm.
You've got my Cosine Concourse. I've literally got 100 horsepower engine 2 inches from my knees. So you've got that feeling of power. You've got the wind. You feel literally you can feel the paint lines as you go over them. And then small things, the noise of the engine, the noise of the wind. And if you're riding through the country, I've smelt bread baking out of somebody's house as you're driving. So it's very visceral. So you all your senses are involved. And I think that's, as a leader, you need to be that way. And that includes the senses of your emotions, your gut.
Yeah. Powerful. That's powerful. Well, Jeff, as always, I appreciate you joining today. And for
I
those,
enjoyed it.
it was fun. It was very fun. And we will sign off now. And if you have additional questions or want to get to know us a little bit better, here's our contact information. Email is typically the best way to reach us. If you'd like to learn more about what we do and how we do it, and certainly even if you have questions about what you've heard or seen here today, more than happy to respond to you. So with that, I am going to exit out. And Jeff, again, appreciate your time. Glad you could join, and we'll see you next time.
All right. Thank you much.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.
All right. Fortunately, I do have some editing capability.
All right.
I'll be able to do that. Let me stop it.
Okay.